Hi, this is Tom Soane and welcome to another episode of The Anonymous Landlord. And today I'm going to give you some tips and advice and tell you some things that you really do need to know if you're going to rent a property to students. Now, maybe you've got an existing student rental property, or you've got a property and you're thinking about renting it to students. Or maybe you're thinking about getting into property investment and the student property market is an area that you've considered. Either way, these are things that you really do need to know. Some of them are a lot more important than others, and there's also some good advice in here too. But first of all, why do landlords rent their properties to students? Well, I'm sorry to say it, students, I really am. But landlords do charge you more than the normal rental rate in the area, purely because, and again, I'm sorry to say it, but students are a higher risk than normal tenants. Now, that's not saying that all students are high risk. I'm just saying that students in general are a higher risk. There is more chance with students of failure to pay rent or damage to the property, wear and tear, and so on. So as a student landlord, you've got to take into account that you may well have to spend a bit more money on repairs and recovering rent and lost rent and so on while you're renting your property out to students. But the increased rent covers that, and if it all goes well, you make more profit. So that's why people invest in student property. Bit more profit. Yes, it's higher risk, but if you get it right, then it's a good risk to take. Now look, wear and tear, that is something you will need to prepare for if you're going to rent a property out to students. Now I know it sounds stereotypical, but students do cause more wear and tear than normal tenants in general. Purely because there's more of them. Normally speaking, you've got house sharing going on, and house sharing does end up with more wear and tear. But also students in general tend to be a little less caring for the property, and really they tend to be a little less caring of the contents of the property too. Look, you've heard all the stories. You know that people say that students just have parties all the time and smash houses up. Well, some do, some don't. It's no different, I suppose, to normal tenants, but it's just more often with students. So that's where the risk is. Now, students are very seasonal, as in student accommodation is seasonal. Now, normally speaking, the term starts in and around the September time, but the good students, the more organised students, they start looking for their properties in and around January time. So I always advise you, if you're a student landlord, to advertise your property in December. Because if you've got your property on the market over the Christmas period, that's when a lot of students are at home and searching for properties through Rightmove, and they're going to bookmark your property if you've advertised it at the right time. And then in January, the most organised students, and in my experience, the more reliable students, tend to start looking actively in January. Now, the general student searching time is January through to about July. Now, you do get a few stragglers after that time. So the last minute people, they tend to pop their heads above the water in August time, leaving it till the last minute. Hey, everyone's different. But you know what? Quite often you do find that you can also charge them a little bit more because they tend to be slightly higher risk because they're last minute type people, less organised, less reliable maybe. And again, I am stereotyping there, so I apologise to any student that hears this that is not that person. I'm not saying that every single one of you individually is this person, but in general, in my experience, the later you are in actively finding a property and the closer to the last minute you are, the more high risk you tend to be. So look, I hope that doesn't annoy too many people. But also student tenancy contracts tend to be for 10 months of the year. Now, you can still insist on 12 months of the year, but generally speaking, a student tenancy contract will be for 10 months because most students for the summer go home. So they don't occupy that property, and therefore they feel like they shouldn't need to pay for it. And you know what? I get it. And that's another reason why you charge more rent for the other 10 months. So a quick calculation for that is to work out what you would normally charge in rent per month, times by 12 and then divide by 10. And that's the figure you're going to get on a monthly basis. Now, normally with a tenancy contract, you would have an AST, an assured short hold tenancy. And my advice to you is try to secure a joint AST. Now, what that means is that all of the students that live in that property are liable for all of the damages and all of the rent. So if you've got 5 students in one property, for an example, and one of those students doesn't pay their fair share of rent, then the other 4 students will need to pick up that bill and cover the full rent, because they are all liable to make sure that the full rent is paid every single month. But they're also liable for the damages to the property together, which means you've got more chance of getting your money back if they don't pay the rent or they damage the property. So if one doesn't pay, or if one person causes all the damage, they all have to pay for it. Now that adds a little bit of security for you as well in a different way, because if you've got one person that's damaging a property, then the chances are the other 4 are going to put a bit of pressure on that one person not to continue doing that. But then there's also guarantors, and you should always get a guarantor with students, in my experience, because it adds a layer of security. Now, students typically don't have their own income, and also where students tend to be a lot younger, aren't as responsible or reliable with their finances. Now, again, I'm not saying that's every single student every single time. So if you are a student and you ever listen to this, then I apologize for stereotyping and pigeonholing you into the general overview. But generally speaking, if you can get a guarantor, then it links with what I've just said about the AST. Think about it. If you've got 5 students on one contract to pay the rent and to look after the property, plus you've also got 5 guarantors with 5 students, then you've got so much more security for your investment property. And that's where the smart investors really make their profits. Yes, you do need to spend a bit more money on wear and tear. Yes, you are taking a bit of a higher risk with the student accommodation. But if you've got a joint AST with all 5 of those students, and you've got guarantors on all of those, you're pretty much secured for your money to come back to you if you need to get serious. But also, a lot of guarantors are easier to get with students because of the support that student parents give to their children. And quite rightly, you know, if my children went to university, I would want to support them in the best way that I can. So it's really good security for you as a landlord if you can get a guarantor and a joint AST. Now, let's say you can't get a joint AST. Let's say you're renting a student property to one person. Still get a guarantor and still make sure that you are prepared for any wear and tear. And then bigger, you know, if you find it difficult to get a joint AST and each of the students wants an individual contract for each of their rooms, okay, you can still do that. But you can also do a joint deposit across all people. And that's not uncommon. Get an inventory. 100%, please, please, please get an inventory. Every single tenancy that moves into that property, get an inventory before they move in. It almost guarantees that you're going to be able to get your money back for any damages that you might, or that the tenants or the students might inflict on your property. Also, here's a little tip. Students do actually speak to other students. So when it comes to the end of one student's term, ask those students to find any other students that would want to move in. Maybe incentivize them. Give them 50 quid, whatever it is. It will save you a cost. Now, I probably shouldn't be saying this because I do have a letting agent, but I'm just saying this as a tip to landlords and some advice. You could just incentivize your current student tenants to find you the next student tenants. Hey, why not? It's worth the question. What's the worst thing they could say? No. Now, we're moving into HMO territory here, which is house of multiple occupancy. And there's masses of compliance and legislation around HMO properties. First of all, you do need planning for a HMO property. Just contact the council, find out what you need, and they'll tell you they need you to have this planning permission. Now, a HMO, generally speaking, is where three people who are not from the same household occupy one property. And there are a few other different variations of that, like sharing of facilities, bathrooms, kitchens. And also a large HMO is where you've got a property of 3 stories or more and renting to 5 people or more. Now, for those properties, you will need a license. And remember that there are some councils that require you to have a license for every HMO property in certain areas. So remember that and don't ignore that. Please don't ignore that. And definitely do your research on HMO criteria, legislation, requirements, because there are very specific requirements. Even things like the size of the communal area, the size of the rooms, the facilities that you're providing, so on and so on. Don't ignore them. You will get penalised. In fact, I think student accommodation is currently one of the hottest areas that councils are looking into. So please do not get that bit wrong. Don't say I didn't warn you. Next up is landlord insurance. Now I'm going to break this into 2 areas, because if you've got landlord insurance currently, you need to let your insurer know that you're renting to students. Please do that. You might well void your insurance if your insurer does not know that they are students renting that property. Secondly, you must make sure you've got landlord's contents insurance as well as landlord's building insurance if you are providing furnishings, furniture and stuff like that. But remember that the landlord's contents insurance only covers your belongings, not the students. So you'll need to advise the student tenants that their own belongings will need to be covered by their own insurances if they want it. Another little tip, which a lot of people don't realise, that landlords, you are responsible for the tenant's antisocial behaviour. Now, for an example, if the tenants are having massive wild parties and disrupting the neighbours and just generally being antisocial, then you are responsible for stopping it. I know that sounds tough for you to take because it's them, it's their lives, it's their doing. But you are responsible. So my advice to you on that is if you are experiencing tenants that are causing antisocial behaviour, then make sure you're communicating with the tenant, asking them to stop, and you are documenting that communication. And any visits you might make to the property, make sure you're recording that visit so that if you ever do have to go to court, then you can prove to the judge, hey judge, look, I did try. I tried to communicate with them. I visited the property. I asked them to stop, but they didn't. Now remember as well, for eviction purposes, antisocial behaviour is currently getting a bit of preference. So just remember that as well. Now, you also still need to abide by the standard requirements for any tenancy. Now, do you remember I did that piece, which was everything you need for every tenancy every time? Well, it's the same thing here. And I won't go through that whole thing because that is a whole video and podcast actually that you need to really study in detail. If you don't know comfortably and confidently everything you need for every tenancy every time, then go and have a listen to the episode for that and it will give it to you in major detail. But first of all, look, quick checklist of those things. You must have an AST contract in place and don't get it wrong. Do you know what? I heard a story where a judge threw out an eviction case because the AST was filled out incorrectly. I mean, you know, what do you do in that instance? It's human error, basic mistake. Anyway, you must have an AST or a tenancy contract. You've got to give that tenant the gas safety certificate every single year. Please don't forget that. You've got to get it done in advance of the tenant moving in, and you must give it to them in advance of their move-in. You've got to give them the energy performance certificate as well. Again, you cannot rent that property out if it's below an E rating. So check your energy performance certificate. Just go onto the EPC register online and you'll be able to see what the rating is of your property. Now, if it's lower than an E, you cannot rent that property out. You must make certain improvements and get a new EPC, energy performance certificate, but also give that EPC certificate to the tenant. Don't forget that one. Now you need an electrical installation condition report, an EICR, that has to be carried out on your property. Now get it done now before the prices rocket up, because I promise you, electricians are just businesses. They're not going to miss a trick. They're going to ramp their price up, and then all of a sudden you're going to have to pay double for the same thing. Get it done now. Be proactive with that. But once you've got that EICR, then you carry out that work. You have to. It's compulsory. Electricians are loving it at the moment. It's a good time to be an electrician. But get that work done, and then your property is eligible and safe and legal to be rented out to tenants. Give the tenant the latest how to rent guide. Just download it from the government website, or do you know what? Send me a message through my Facebook page and I'll send it to you if that's easier for you. I don't mind. I just want to make sure you're getting it right. It's not charging you anything. I'm not making any money out of the how to rent guides, but I just want to make sure you're getting it right and you're not getting penalised for not giving it to the tenant, and especially not giving the most up-to-date one. Now you need to carry out your right to rent checks. Definitely, that's a big one, especially if you're renting to foreign students. Do not forget the right to rent checks, and do not forget to renew them. Please don't forget to renew them. Oof, I've heard some horror stories about landlords being fined huge amounts just because they didn't renew the right to rent checks. Crazy, crazy, crazy. But anyway, your right to rent checks, get them right. You've got to be really accurate with them. And lastly, your deposit. You have to register the deposit in the same way that you would in any other tenancy. You must register it within 30 days of receipt. Receipt, that's the key, not 30 days of the tenancy. I know letting agents that get that bit wrong. Come on, you've got to get that bit right. Letting agents get it wrong, landlords get it wrong. You are not allowed to keep that tenant in your bank. It's not your money, it's the tenant's money, and you must register it with either the DPS, the TDS, or My Deposits within 30 days of receipt. So I hope that helps. Now look, let me put a brighter picture on this. I'm going to give you a blue sky, because I don't want to make it sound like renting to students is terrible. It's actually not. Renting to students is a very popular and very viable way to invest in property. So the upsides of it are, I mentioned earlier on, there is a definite higher profit margin. But it's a higher risk, but it's a higher profit margin. So if you get it right and you have it all properly systemized and automated and delegated, then you could be a very, very happy property investor, because you're going to make a lot of money from student accommodation. I promise you that. Now look, I can't say that there's no risk. Of course there's risk. Even if you get it right, there's always risk. But get it right, lower that risk, increase your income, you're doing very well. But make sure you follow all of the compliance. And once you've got it done, you've got it done. And then you can carry on, get that money in, and then live happily ever after. But also, student accommodation is always in high demand. So there's a quick way to check that demand. Just go on to Rightmove, for an example. You can actually search specifically for student accommodation. Have a look and see how much is on the market in an area. If there's loads on the market, and not a lot let agreed, the demand is low. If there's loads on the market and loads let agreed, or there's not many on the market and loads let agreed, then the demand is good. So hopefully that all gives you a bit of an idea. Now there's so much more to student accommodation and student property investing than just that. But I figured I didn't want to start getting into all of the regulations and legislation about student accommodation. I just wanted to give you the heads up of the things that you really need to know. But also, look, if you need some help with this, look, I don't ever want to plug myself really, but I probably should. But my letting agent can help you if you need some help with student accommodation, whether it be documents, management, finding tenants, advertising only. My company will advertise your student property for you. Then let me know. But until then, hopefully that helps everyone. And please join me in saying, my name's Tom Soane, and this is the Anonymous Landlord.